Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. On behalf of the UNESCO Global Educational Monitoring Report and the Australian Council for Educational Research, we'd like to warmly welcome you to this exciting webinar that we have today on the future of EdTech in the Pacific. The webinar primarily unpacks some of the key findings and recommendations of UNESCO's 2024 GEM report on technology and education in the Pacific. My name is Dr. Tim Friedman from ACR, and it's my honour to be chairing today's session. We've got really a wonderful panel for you today, including an introduction from Francesca Indrisi, from the research and policy. She's a research and policy analyst from the GEM report from UNESCO, and she's the coordinator of the Pacific Regional Report. We have my colleague, Jung Nitschke, Research Fellow in the Education and Development Program from ACER. We have Dr. Anna Dabrowski, Senior Research Fellow in the Education and Development Program at ACER. We have Nora Warren, Assistant CEO from the Ministry of Education and Culture, Samoa. We have Professor Jason Lodge, the Professor of Education Psychology from the University of Queensland. And lastly, we also have my colleague, Dr. Sujin Yang, a Research Fellow in the Assessment Transformation Program from ACR. We do have quite a packed agenda for you today, but before we begin, I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country. I join you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and some of my fellow panelists are represented from other lands. In the spirit of reconciliation, ACR acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. We also acknowledge our Pacifica communities and participants today and the enduring knowledge, wisdom and contributions that you bring. We're committed to listening, learning and collaborating with you. Okay, so the digital transformation sweeping the Pacific Islands offers unprecedented opportunities and brings with them a series of different challenges. On the one hand, we have new technologies that can help bridge educational divides and empower every learner, no matter how remote the community. On the other hand, actually achieving this goal is not so straightforward, and we risk doing more harm than good if we go into it blind without coming up with a solution that suits the region and not simply a one-size-fits-all approach. It's essential to understand how we can leverage technology to enrich teaching and learning while ensuring solutions are resilient, locally relevant, and inclusive. We'll start off today hearing from our partners from UNESCO who made all this work possible. We'll then hear from a key stakeholder and partner of ours from one of the bigger Pacific countries to hear some of the local perspectives. We'll then learn about policy approaches to using educational technology across a range of different contexts within the Pacific Islands, as well as how things are actually working on the ground. We'll then discuss what we mean by education technology, what's working best and where and what's going wrong. And we'll also hear about some of the relevant policies and frameworks relevant to this area. So just a general little bit of housekeeping. You're certainly welcome to use the chat function at any stage. Our presenters will keep talking until the end, but there is a QA function that you can ask any questions. We will have some time at the end to answer some questions that you have. So for now, I'm going to start off by running a video that was pre-recorded by our dear colleague Francesca from UNESCO.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Francesca Indrisi, and I'm delighted on behalf of the Global Education Monitor Report to kick off this webinar series, and specifically this session with a focus on EdTech in the Pacific. But first of all, let me thank our friends from the Australian Council of Educational Research for organizing this webinar and for being here today and exchanging and reporting on the experiences and the research on this. Fortunately, I cannot be there with you live, but technology still allows us to be in touch, exchange. The Pacific, we know, is a unique region for its geography, its culture, and also for the application of information and communication technology in education. And it deserves a specific attention. For that reason, the Global Education Monitoring Board decided to dedicate a specific regional report on education technology in the Pacific, and we did it with Commonwealth of Learning. The report was launched last year, the occasion of Choga in Samoa, and covers 17 territories and countries in the Pacific. It looks at 4 key policy areas of PACREF and investigates in depth the challenges as well as the potentials of the deployment of information and communication technology in education. It's supported by authoritative research that was conducted researchers and experts working on the region, and including researchers who are going to present later. The report concludes with a series of recommendations that I'm going to present briefly and shortly that we think can be used as a compass by policymakers when it comes to deploy education technology in education, and can also inform the debate of the today webinar session. As you can see, the 4 recommendations of the Global Education Monitoring Report on the Pacific starts from the teachers and students' needs, as you can see from the visualization, as we put them at the center. And we ask governments to use this compass when deciding on digital technology in education. We also ask ourselves as researchers when we conducted the analysis, if the education technology deployed those education system was appropriate. And perhaps inevitably, given the lack of resources, most technology tools used in the Pacific are transposed without sufficient consideration of the context in which students learn. Many governments are trying to adopt tools and engage with the peers, but these efforts need to be justified. Second question regards equity and if digital technology is indeed equitable. Increasing resilience through increased investments is, we know, a global challenge. It's highly debated, and including in the Pacific, given its unique geography, demography, the vulnerability to natural disasters, and also the small market size. So it's difficult to regulate and this type of market, and making sure that the presence of many actors with also the diverse interests and consistencies are aligned. The third question regarding scalability, and due to the small size of specifically Pacific Island states, this can be a challenge, maybe more pressing than for other countries. So it's important, and this has been demonstrated, that countries have to pull together to create regional public goods, and specifically in areas like infrastructure. And the last question, and not by importance, is sustainability, and whether the technology deployed in education is sustainable from a social, economic, but also environmental point of view. The Pacific is not immune to these challenges that are threatening schools, communities, societies. Policymakers have shown awareness and responsiveness to those concerns. There is still scope for improvement through coordination and policy dialogue. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I invite you to have a look at our reports. And I also wish you productive exchange and discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was really insightful. I'll now pass on to my colleagues, Anna and Yong.
Thank you, Tim. Anna and I conducted a case study in the Pacific as part of the background research for the GEM report in the Pacific. So next slide, please, Anna. So the aim of the report was to review current practices and look at implications of technology integration and its impact on teachers and the teaching profession within the school and tertiary education settings. So we conducted 4 case studies with a deep dive into the experience of teachers in Samoa, Palau, the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and used key stakeholder interviews as well as secondary analysis of student assessment data across the Pacific, namely the PILNA assessment. Next slide, please, Anna. What we found was that technology has been expanding in the Pacific, as it has been in many parts of the world. The Pacific being very remote and with outlying islands, it's particularly difficult in terms of penetration for the use of technology and integrating it fully into the education system. However, we do understand that there, apart from the undersea cable that has been assisting many of the countries in the region, there is an emergence with Starlink in the region, and it is being accessible by mostly the private sector, and it is still very much cost prohibitive for most of the population in the Pacific. So ICT infrastructure is expanding, cell phone usage and ownership is also expanding, but it is bringing with it some key concerns and pushback from parents in terms of the wellbeing aspects. And then also we know that there are aspirations in the Pacific, particularly with governments trying to improve the digital literacy of its citizens and integrating policies into the education system. So Nora will be able to speak about that in the particular context of Samoa. What we see is that despite policies that support ICT integration in the education sector, there's very little insight or practical guidelines around what a digital literate citizen would look like. And I'm hoping Jason and Sujing can discuss more of that from their research across different areas. We also know that in the Pacific, donors and international organisations have played a key role in fast tracking and promoting ICT in education. That has actually opened lots of doors. Particularly, we see early adopters in the tertiary education sector. However, there has been some remarkable and very impactful case studies that we found with teacher professional development using technology, and I noticed there are some colleagues who are online today who have been involved in some of those very successful case studies. The only problem is that a lot of that donor funding is not sustainable, and it really is the over-reliance on donor funding is really driving what is happening in the Pacific in terms of technology in the future. So bear that in mind as well. I'll hand over to Anna to speak more about the teacher landscape.
Thanks, Yong. I think one of the greatest challenges with conducting this research, and this was our second case study for the UNESCO GEM report at ACR, is the underrepresentation of the Pacific in current research efforts, particularly when it comes to education technology. And particularly as there is increasing push, as Yong mentioned, from donors, but also private education providers in the Pacific region to be integrating education technology. It was really important for us to be able to showcase some of the practices that are happening, but also to highlight some of the challenges facing both teachers and students in the Pacific, particularly as EdTech rolls out at rapid speed. So with our case study on teachers and technology in the Pacific, what we found through both our qualitative and quantitative analysis is that many teachers still lack adequate ICT skills. And even though in the university and tertiary sector, there are pockets of innovation and upskilling of teachers to actually use education technology, once teachers get into the classroom, a lack of resources, a lack of infrastructure, a lack of access to technology hampers their efforts to be able to integrate EdTech. Not all teachers across the Pacific have the same professional learning opportunities. So we see a great divide in terms of teachers in urban spaces and those in rural and in the Pacific Islands. And particularly when it comes to professional development for teachers, there's great disparity there too. We can see that teachers are using digital technology, but it's not consistent. And as Jung mentioned, it is very much predicated on donors, on volunteers, and exacerbated by chronic teacher shortages in the region as well. When we look at technology in the Pacific, I think this photo sums it up quite well from one of Jung and my fieldwork trips, that there is a lot of technological investment, but often not the infrastructure to support. So we really do need to have a look at the effectiveness of education technologies before there is a rollout without a level of readiness and understanding of teachers' capacity, but even of the resourcing and access that ministries have available and that schools themselves have available in the region. Probably a large concern for us as researchers is that there is very little evidence on the quality of tools and pedagogies being used. And I know that Sujing and Jason will talk about this more in the session, but particularly as there's increased interest in AI, and there are some examples perhaps of EdTech and AI being seen as answers to teacher shortages in the region. We really don't have any good evidence at the moment that EdTech is being successfully used and implemented in the Pacific, and we do need more information on that. And there's very little evidence of the impact of digital technology on student learning whatsoever. There's also very little evidence in the Pacific in terms of how digital tech can be used to support students with disabilities or who face additional barriers. But at the same time, the Pacific is incredibly vulnerable to pressure to roll out EdTech at scale, even without an evidence base. And as Jung touched on before, what we saw in the Pacific compared to other countries we've worked in globally is that there is parental concern and teacher concern and resistance around the use of education technology. And so some hesitance and resistance to use tech in the home, but also in schools because of student safety and well-being. And really what we observed in our research is that there is very little evidence at all that any kind of safeguarding measures are being considered in the Pacific as education technology forms a strategic agenda for ministries. So our sort of research at ACR sort of leads into Nora's session if she's able to join us, otherwise we'll go to Sujing. But I think, some important questions as we're thinking about who tech works for, and the UNESCO GEM report highlighted this in terms of the title of the report, a tool on whose terms. So who technology serves, who it's benefiting, and that's where I'll leave our session and hand over. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Anna and Jung. That was really insightful. We're going to now ask Professor Jason Lodge to present his slides.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. I'm joining you from Meanjin on the Maiwar, otherwise known as Brisbane on the Brisbane River, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of these unceded lands. I am going to bring three perspectives to this discussion. One is that I am a teacher. I teach future teachers. Two is that I run a research lab where we're trying to understand what technology means for learning, particularly recently around AI. But thirdly is also that I've been involved increasingly in the policy space. I did some work for the Federal Department of Education in Australia, which was part of the OECD's High Performing Systems of Tomorrow project. And it was really about thinking, what does this all look like over the next 15 years, in particular relative to AI and the expanding capabilities there. There has been a very strong focus within that work on the Asia Pacific region more broadly. And as you'll see, there's some alignments between some of the things that we've been finding through that work and what's come out in this report. Obviously, the big topic of discussion over the last 2 years has been the potential impact of generative AI, in particular, ChatGPT and other tools that are emerging. And, there are some enormous benefits that are potentially within this technology, but there's also some fairly significant challenges, I think it's safe to say. There are three that I wanted to touch on here. Just simply having access to these technologies, as we've already heard, this is a big issue in the Pacific already before we add artificial intelligence into the mix. There are concerns about existing and widening digital divides. While some people promise that this age of AI is going to narrow some of those divides, we are already starting to see some trends in the opposite direction. And then I think, importantly, trends for the age of AI. And it's put 4 there twice. I don't know whether they went. What we've seen through this, particularly across the Asia Pacific region, is that there are vast differences in readiness for this revolution that we're supposedly having now. We're seeing very strong policy responses in China and Singapore in particular. But if we look elsewhere across the Asia Pacific, we're seeing quite a mix of responses to AI in education. Again, as we've already heard, the work that we've been doing reinforces the idea that infrastructure and access are major issues. And there are the background issues that many of us will be familiar with around workforce, basic literacy and numeracy, and a wide range of issues. So I don't want to sort of say that this is all about some of the things that I'm going to specifically focus on. The trends in the work that we've been doing suggest a very similar pattern across the wider Asia Pacific region. What I want to focus on, though, in the time that I've got is what seems to be really going on here, and what does this suggest about the future of education in the Pacific and more broadly. There's a lot of commentary out there about how AI is going to either ruin education for all time or is going to save us all by creating robot teachers. And I'm sure you've heard all of this commentary that tends to be in one direction or the other. It's all good or it's all bad. I mean, of course, the reality is it's going to be somewhere in between. I think that these are significant issues with AI. At the moment, we're talking about a reality where most of these technologies exist in these enormous server farms, mostly in North America. And it requires a lot of computing power and a lot of access to network technology to be able to even use any of these emerging tools in the generative AI space. And I think that means that it is inherently quite exclusionary, particularly if you are in a place like Pacific Islands where you're not necessarily going to be able to access these tools effectively. My sense is that this is going to change quite rapidly over the next few years. We've already seen with DeepSeek emerging from China that these large language models that underpin generative AI tools can be developed more efficiently and effectively at a smaller scale. And the predictions are suggesting that instead of large server farms like this, what we're going to see is that we will have versions of smaller language models that we will be able to run on individual devices, which do not necessarily require a high bandwidth access to a network. So that space, I think, is going to shift quite dramatically. And it does open up opportunities to overcome some of these access and digital divide issues if it's done well. So I can certainly see some possibilities when we have, contained localized systems that can run generative AI on the ground rather than relying on these enormous server farms. But I want to shift to the bit that we've been focused on in our lab work over the last 2 years, which is what are the sorts of competencies that seem to be the really critical ones? And this, I think, suggests where education systems might need to head in the future. Sujing and I and a couple of other colleagues started to think about this relative to the technologies that we're more familiar with. People often make the comparison between the calculator and generative AI in education. Now, there's a fundamental set of differences here that I think are really important that we try to unpick in this paper. But I think the bottom line is that the technologies that we have used largely up until this point in education, our calculator there being one example, we use them as a tool, right? We give them something to do, they give us some sort of output, we use that output in some sort of meaningful way, right? So it's very transactional. Now, generative AI is fundamentally different in that Google's Gemini here being one example, while it's not a peer or a collaborator, it's not conscious, it's not reasoning or thinking or anything like that, it feels like it is. And we know this because when you ask people, and you might think about this yourself, if you've used a generative AI tool, do you say please and thank you to it? And would you find yourself saying please and thank you to a calculator? That inherently, I think, points to the really critical difference here. All right, this feels like a peer or a collaborator. Lots of people out there, to the point that one of the companies behind this is complaining OpenAI in this case, that it's costing them millions of dollars because people say please and thank you to these technologies so much. They're still a tool, but they're a tool that feels like a collaborator. And I think that opens up a lot of opportunities, but also creates some challenges. Part of the challenge here is that technology can be used to either offload learning, in this case, almost completely, as in the case in all of the commentary around using AI to cheat, versus being able to extend our capabilities, right? How do we use technology in ways that allow us to do more than we would be able to do ourselves? Anna's already mentioned that there is some commentary out there about AI becoming teachers. I don't see that this is a feasible option, at least the way that the technology is evolving at the moment. But perhaps these technologies could work as a tutor. We've got some way to go. I don't want to say that they're going to necessarily be good at that right now, but there's some possibilities there. I think teaching is something that is a fundamentally human activity that sophisticated algorithms and databases on a server farm in North America can't do at this point in time. So I think there's an important distinction there that's worth thinking about. Underneath all of that is a discussion about AI literacy being the key to what curriculum and education systems need to focus on. I don't quite buy that argument. I think that there is something about this conversation that's focused too much on a student using a machine to help them with their learning. But of course, we know that at any time, any student anywhere, including students in the Pacific and everywhere else around the world, are constantly within a network of technologies and people, their teachers, and all of these components around them that assist with their learning. So we need to think about this as a more holistic situation. I also think that there's something really fundamental in the way that we communicate with machines now. So this is Margaret Hamilton, who worked for NASA. Though that is the set of instructions that she needed in order to talk to a computer back in the 1960s. Now, a 3 or 4-year-old can talk to a computer and tell it what to do. Now, a 3 or 4-year-old is not sending an Apollo rocket to the moon, but nonetheless, the ways in which we communicate with machines have fundamentally altered, and it's very easy to talk to a machine now. So what this suggests is that machines are meeting us where we are. And I think our education systems probably need to think about how they might adjust accordingly. I don't think it's about AI literacy. What I think it is more about is putting the student back at the center of all of this. All of the research that we've been doing and that others have been doing is suggesting that in order to be a good learner with AI, as it is evolving, because it is something that we can communicate with so easily, you need to be a good learner first. Good learner first, good learner with AI second. The students who we're seeing who are already very good at doing this, they understand themselves and their own learning patterns. And from there, they're able to take this tool and integrate it into the way that they learn. They then will use other tools as needed as they navigate through any sort of learning environment or teaching situation. So we're trying to think about this more holistically, and I think that that raises some questions, and I think we starts to point us in a direction of what the high-performing educations of tomorrow might look like. We think it's mostly about this idea here, adaptive skills and knowledge for the age of AI, and this is a conversation that I think is happening quite a bit here in the Australian context, particularly at the secondary and tertiary level. And what I'm talking about here are these kind of fundamental skills that allow us to use technologies that act like peers or collaborators in a meaningful way, because they do respond to us in that way. It's more like working with another person than it is working with a machine, even though they're still machines. So some of these fundamental skills that we have learned that are important for us to interact and learn from each other are perhaps even more critical than ever. It's less about knowing how the machine works, because it can help us to understand that itself, and more about these kinds of skills. The same goes for teachers. And I think the idea that AI can replace a teacher, that somehow some algorithms and a database is going to be able to manage a situation like that you see there on the screen, is just not realistic. You know, there is something very deeply embodied and social about the way that we as teachers operate in classrooms. So again, I think it reinforces this idea that these fundamentally human skills are the kind of critical piece of the puzzle here. So these are the sorts of things that we're talking about here, being adaptive, focusing on the kind of human and social skills that are at the core of being able to use technology well. There's something about the way we embody knowledge and knowing, and how we evaluate, make judgments, and make decisions. I think it's less and less about those technical skills, because the machines are meeting us where we are. And the sense that I'm getting is that there is now globally a bit more of a push to understand what exactly these skills look like and what component of understanding of AI needs to sit on top of this for our education systems to be able to adapt both in the short term and in the long term. So there's a lot going on there, but hopefully you can see how that might resonate against the report that we're talking about for this session. I think it opens up enormous opportunities, but there are also some challenges, and I think that there's some shifts in thinking that we might need to make as part of this process. And I'll hand over. I think Sujing's next.
Thank you very much for that, Jason. That was really quite interesting. Just before we pass on to my colleague, I just want to remind you that we do have a Q&A function. You'll see that at the bottom there. Please feel free to ask questions. We will have some time at the end, and my colleagues try and make them controversial as well. My colleagues will love to sort of answer them and potentially debate them. Some of them have some different perspectives. Okay, so I'm now going to pass on to my colleague, Dr. Sujing Yang.
Thanks, team. Thanks, my colleagues. Okay, today I'm going to introduce some tools and frameworks to support better decision-making in EdTech. We have already recognized there's plenty of needs from our collaborators from system and school levels. They reflect they are currently considering design different levels of policy and guidelines, and also they are looking for some tools and framework to help them monitor and evaluate existing and also proposed adoption of EdTech. So today I'm going to introduce two frameworks and tools to help you guys to start doing these two things. The first one, the past principles. This work is based on the project conducted as part of the PhD internship by Jonathan Brazil under the supervision of Dr. Fabian van der Klee and myself. This report is freely available on the ACER research repertory. And this work was initially initiated because we recognize there's a need for a clear and accessible guideline for teachers and school leaders in using AI in teaching and learning. Although there are numerous guidelines for and also frameworks for teachers or schools are available currently, but it's still not very clear to what extent this framework provides cohesive and up-to-date and coherent and also practical guidance. So this project therefore looked at existing guidelines as well as broader research and frameworks. In developing these past principles, our central question was what guiding principles should be considered when using AI for teaching and learning. The principles developed reflect a human-centered approach to AI, which means the technology is designed and used in ways that prioritize human interest. In a nutshell, we reviewed a synthesis of AI principles by Adams and colleagues published in 2023, as well as other relevant education-specific guidelines, including Australian Framework for Generative AI in Schools, OECD's Opportunities Guideline and Guardrail for Effective and Equitable Use of AI in Education, and AI Guidance for Schools Toolkit, and the last one, Generative AI in Higher Ed, a global perspective of institutional adoption policies and guidelines. Specifically, our principles highlight the importance of 4 areas. The first one is to promote teaching and learning by using AI purposefully and monitoring its impact. The second one is advancing well-being and social interaction, attending to the broader purpose of education and AI's potential to enhance rather than replace human teaching and social interactions in education. And third one is train for AI literacy of students and educators, especially for teaching and learning purpose. and also the harnessing the AI ethically guided by ethical principles, legal frameworks, and other ethical considerations. Okay, look back on the first one. Promote teaching and learning has three essential components. The first one is benefits, which means the benefit of using AI should outweigh the cost. And evaluation means the evaluation of AI should be considered to ensure it effectively enhances the educational experience. And thinking refers to effectively encourage and evaluate learning. Educators should consider, for example, designing tasks for students that AI cannot complete, and also encourage higher order thinking, creativity, critical analysis of AI, and also some self-regulatory behaviors, and providing clear guidance regarding how students can use AI in their own work, such as during examinations. And the second one, specifically, we're looking at teachers' ability to enhance their ability by using AI, not replacing them. And for students, we're looking at balanced school experience. And the third one, we are looking for training for AI literacy, involving building teacher and student understandings of what AI is, how it works, how it can be used effectively and ethically, and also fostering values and attitudes around the use of AI. The UNESCO's competency framework for students and teachers is very valuable. Documents are identified by the key considerations in training for AI literacy and relevant skills. And across all guidelines reviewed, there was considerable emphasis on ethical use of AI. In the report, we unpack each of these considerations into more detail. We draw attention to transparency, responsibility, and accountabilities, privacy, justice, and fairness, and also the rights of humans and children and workers. And the next tool I'm gonna introduce is the Education Technology Value Evaluation Suite. This tool was developed by Ralph Sobin, the Deputy CEO of ACER, along with my colleagues, Dr. Pauline Taylor-Guy and Dr. Fabian Vanderklay. This suite recognizes the needs of schools to review existing and evaluate new adoption of technology to replace or enhance educational practices. So its focus is on supporting teachers and school leaders to better understand and evaluate the EdTech application. This tool and its associated service has been developed based on current research and good practice, aimed to guide and purposeful use of ed technology to target student learning. The suite comprises three related evaluation frameworks: Education Technology Enterprise Audit, Existing Application Review, and Application Selection Review, and a rubric for estimating values for all the existing and future applications. This suite is not primarily intended to measure the technology, but rather is a framework to support teachers and school leaders to engage critically with educational technology. Okay, let's look at the first one, the Education Technology Enterprise Audit. This one is designed to give schools a high-level snapshot of educational technologies they currently use and how this align with their teaching and learning goals. And this framework focuses on three main areas: technology use in teaching and learning, administration, and ICT infrastructure. And the following ones you can see there's a value evaluation rubric, helps schools make balanced judgment about the value of each technology. The rubric looks at three different key dimensions. The first one is improvement, second cost, and also alternatives. And second two, existing application review framework and application selection framework. We're looking at current and the future adoption of EdTech. And these two frameworks follow a very similar structure. They guide schools to gather and assess evidence across 8 key categories, starting with functionality and covering all other important aspects. What's very unique here is the strong emphasis on learning. The frameworks propose reviewers and also teachers, school leaders to think about the technology through a learning lens using clear descriptors and performance indicators that link directly to improvements in student learning processes and outcomes. To sum up, the evaluation suite can be used for auditing overall technology use in schools and supporting decisions about specific applications and checking for gaps, overlaps, or even compatibility between tools. Before I end my presentation, I would like to share some general principles if we use such tools and frameworks in school levels or system levels. The first one is the design and inclusion of EdTech, including AI, should not fall solely on individual teacher or school leader. Instead, we can consider better outcome or achieve better outcomes through co-creation and co-design. And second one, any plan, policy, or review process needs to be contextualized. For example, smaller schools may not have the capacity to evaluate new technologies on their own. In these cases, education authorities can play a greater role in supporting the evaluation and decision-making process. And third one, we must emphasize keep human-centered approach at the heart of how we integrate technology into teaching and learning. And finally, the last one is incorporating EdTech review into school-wide strategic plans. And also review processes, they can support ongoing school improvement in more structured and sustainable ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sujing. That was excellent as always. It's been really interesting to hear sort of across the different presentations we've had so far today. Some sort of common themes, I guess, about ensuring that we contextualize things. We don't rush to what we said earlier about having a one size fits all approach. Now, I do have to apologise on behalf of our colleague Nora, who unfortunately has had some technical difficulties in joining us today. So we might actually start off with the question and answer session now. You've heard from each of our panelists, and you've heard them talk about things from a different perspective. So I will invite anybody that has any questions. You can use the Q&A function. We're not such a big group today, so I think we could also have a raised hand situation if somebody did want to ask a question. So I'll just give you a moment if you do want to ask any questions. I might, just while you might have a chance to think about that, I might just ask one of my own first. It's probably more directed to you, Anna. I was thinking about things that are sort of unique to the region that might have come out of this report. You know, as we said before, what happens in other contexts might not necessarily be the same for Pacific. It's obviously its own region. I think you were saying something about safety and well-being online that was a bit different in the Pacific. Could you potentially expand on that? And I guess any other barriers that you see in utilizing technology that might be Pacific specific?
Sure, no problem. I'll start off and I think Jason Jung, you probably will have comments on this as well. One of the things that I think that has struck me about working in the Pacific, and it's a shame we didn't have our Pacifica counterpart with us today, so I'm hoping just to share some insights from our education stakeholders, is yes, that there certainly seems to sort of be a lack of safeguarding at the same time that sort of educational technology is being rolled out. And I think that probably speaks to the unique pressures actually facing the region in terms of the vulnerability that ministries are often under when there is the donor influence, but also the presence of EdTech providers. And I think, you know, as a sort of a slight provocation, that there is an immense pressure to be seen to be doing something in the digital space, which does mean, and we saw this at the Heads of Commonwealth meeting in Samoa last year, that often sort of quite predatory providers do appear in these spaces. And often it's very challenging, as our ministry representatives, our teachers, our university lecturers told us, to resist some of the pressure to be actually implementing these education technologies. And Jason touched on it before, but certainly what we heard from ministry representatives is this idea that teachers are going to be replaced in the short term with chatbots, with digital agents. And we know that there isn't the infrastructure to support this, but also this sort of, again, idea that the teaching profession in the Pacific is replaceable, I think is something quite unique. So again, you know, this is our second report that we've done for the UNESCO GEM report, but that was something that we observed in the Pacific, and certainly something we heard from our stakeholders. On the other side, and this is perhaps slightly controversial, but you know, I think that the resistance that we're seeing with education stakeholders is quite positive. I think the skepticism that parents in particular are expressing about their children being online is quite healthy, and we're not seeing that as much in other countries that are moving rapidly to embrace education technologies. So again, sort of speaking on behalf of the participants that I've spoken to, and that Jung and Elizabeth, our other colleague, spoke to with this study, I think that there are pockets of optimism where maybe there is a chance to sort of push back on some of the less productive education technology agendas. But I might also hand to Jason. I think you probably have some thoughts with your work in this space too.
Thanks, Hannah. I think it's worth reflecting on across the whole Asia Pacific, the sort of variation that there is across those jurisdictions, just simply if you think across one dimension of scale, right? So if you think about the countries that have got significant scale, they can start to drill into some of the complexities around the regulations and the way in which these technologies are rolled out across education sectors. That's just not going to be possible in other parts, including in the Pacific. So part of me, I think, is mindful that this work is so important because it helps connect countries that may not have the scale to be able to do the work that's required, to other places where they can kind of leverage some of the work that's happening there. It's such a complex mix of factors that we're talking about whenever we talk about technology in education, partly because the technology moves so quickly that by the time we actually figure out what the mechanisms are that are leading into the ways in which these technologies impact on learning and teaching, the newest technology has already started to impact and the conversation has moved on. And I think that's particularly true with AI. So the more we can connect up jurisdictions and countries that don't necessarily have the scale to be able to do a lot of that testing and figuring stuff out for themselves, I think the better place then everybody's going to be in terms of understanding what kind of regulations and guardrails and privacy protections and transparency that we need to have in place. And I think particularly AI raises some significant risks across all of those dimensions. So I do see some risk there. And I can see how that often then might result in, here's a simple off-the-shelf solution that a big ed tech provider is coming out and saying is going to fix all of our problems. That's very tempting if you don't necessarily have the scale to be able to push back and say, we've done the work to understand what this means in our context, and you know, we're not able to actually unpack that for what it means for our education system. So it's complicated.
Thank you so much for that, Anna and Jason. We do have a question that's come up in the Q&A, so I will read it out now. Thinking about equity and cultural awareness in the Pacific, where does relational responsive standpoint theory sit or fit in the path or eval suite thinking, it seemed to be missing. I'm not sure who wants to sort of raise the hand to answer that one. One of our brave panelists.
I can talk about some of the experience that we've had in the Australian context that's a little bit different. But in the frameworks that we've developed for the Australian context, we've been thinking very carefully about Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous ways of knowing, and how they're not necessarily represented in the way that generative AI in particular is impacting on the kinds of messages that that technology is perpetuating and amplifying. I know that that's a very different context, but I think that the point here is that there is work happening, particularly here in Australia, to try and understand what the kind of cultural piece and the cultural awareness component is within all of this. And, as with many of these issues, that's also complicated, and it is very unfortunate that we don't have a colleague from that context with us today, because it really should be a conversation that's happening, from within those cultural groups, so that is driven by people who have that cultural knowledge and are from that part of the world. So that's the way that we're starting to think about that in the Australian context, but how that speaks to what's happening in the Pacific, I guess, is up to that conversation happening in that context.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Sujing, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just would like to add on Jason's response. Yeah, I agree. Yes, our principles and also the frameworks haven't got any evidence from the Pacific, but I think that's future. That's the gap we need to fill. Yeah, as Anna mentioned in her presentation, we have got limited evidence currently in this area and need some representativeness. So I think that's a good future direction we can come up with and in the future projects. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jason and Sujing, for answering that question. Listen, I certainly agree. More data is often the answer to these sorts of things there, and we certainly all collectively need to be doing more. Now, I want to ask another question, and I'm recognizing we don't have too much more time. It's been touched on today about EdTech companies that might not necessarily have the best intentions in play, constantly changing technologies. You've got to certainly feel for the people out there in the field and the thick of things, school leaders that have got lots on their plate already. They want to embrace educational technology, but it's quite hard where to get started with, noise coming from all directions. If you could give one piece of advice to these school leaders wanting to sort of, utilize educational technology for the good, what would that advice be?
I'll start, Tim. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think about my own experiences as a student and the interactions that I had with technology. And over the period of that span, it became evident to me that it wasn't necessarily about learning the technology itself. It was about a set of skills that I needed to approach learning how to use that technology. And I know that sounds a little bit meta, but since I was in primary school, we were talking about DOS command codes and various things like that for anybody who's familiar with the technology and been around that long. I haven't used any of that stuff in decades, but what has stuck is my ability to be able to work in a technical domain, solve problems, engage in trial and error, and kind of try to figure it out. So I think sometimes there's a bit too much pressure to be getting on to the next fancy, shiny technology. And sometimes it's both A, more effective, and B, sometimes easier for us to just focus on what is the human component in this and what's the way that we can help our students to understand that it's kind of normal to engage with these things and get stuck and find it confusing and help them to work through those things. So whatever technology appears tomorrow or in 5 years' time, they've got those kinds of fundamental skills there to be able to engage with that, because we don't know what the technology is going to look like in 5 years. So what are those skills and how can we help foster those? And sometimes that's easier. It doesn't require fancy technology. It just requires understanding our students and helping them to understand themselves.
And Jason, do you think there's been issues in the past where sort of, I guess, professional development opportunities have been sort of too narrowly focused on how to implement this technology, which, as you said, often becomes sort of outdated or obsolete quite quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge history of it. We needed to learn Windows, and we did a whole lot of stuff on Windows. We needed to learn electronic whiteboards, and we did a whole lot of stuff on. More recently, it was things like blockchain, and like it's gone on for decades. But I think we need to ask ourselves the question at some point: what is the consistent thing that is running through all of that that we can help students to develop that is going to allow them to thrive no matter what the technology looks like in the future? So yeah, I think there's been a long history of that, Tim.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Listen, we've got one question that it's probably all we'll have time for today. It's probably not necessarily an easy one to answer, but hopefully someone might have some insights. Are there any promising examples in the Pacific countries or similar contexts that are further advanced in terms of addressing regulations, safety concerns, etc., that we could point other countries to who are looking at ways to explore the world of educational technology and AI?
Can comment, Tim. Just sort of based on some very emergent evidence. Thanks, Belinda, for your question as well. A little while ago at ACI, Belinda, you'll remember that we did a large study, and some of our colleagues are here today looking at mental health and wellbeing interventions. And as part of that, we did look at the Pacific region, and we did find very little evidence, particularly in terms of interventions or programs that actually have sort of inbuilt regulations or training around addressing some of these safety concerns. One thing that we are aware of is that, particularly with UNICEF's presence in the Pacific and some new staff coming from UNICEF headquarters, that this is very much on the radar at the moment. And so some of the work that UNICEF is conducting and some partners from the World Bank, particularly looking at ways to integrate into early childhood programming and practice more sort of safety guidelines and instructions. But I do think it is a gap. And I know, Jason, you talked about this, that you've worked on some guidelines and regulations, and as have UNESCO. But it's certainly something that does need to be looked at. It is a gap in low and middle income countries and in the development sector. But here we have lessons from education in emergencies contexts, particularly in spaces in Africa and where there are vulnerable and ultra marginalized populations. So I think this is an area that the Pacific certainly needs to look at, and it is missing from the conversation. And our colleagues in UNESCO are about to host a digital skills week in the coming months, and the wellbeing and safeguarding component is still pretty emergent. So I think it's a very valuable point and something that needs to be looked at, as well as this idea of sort of building digital literacy at the same time.
Thanks very much for that. Listen, we unfortunately we've run out of time, so I do see there's one last question or comment. I will just read it out. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to quite address it, but it's probably quite a nice sort of parting thought. There's a lot of focus on what's changing in developing countries or Timor for the context, but there really isn't access to computer or internet. Should there not be a focus on implementing the basic educational technology well before layering it with emerging technologies? I see Anna is trying to answer that online. That would be best. It's a very good question / statement to pose as we depart. But I just want to thank so much, firstly, my panelists for joining. Special thanks to UNESCO and the GEM report team for partnering ACR on this important webinar. Francesca and her colleagues, Nora, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, Anna, Jung, Jason, Sujing, insightful thoughts. To the audience for coming along, and participation was great. Everybody else that helped shape the UNESCO GEM report. We hope this isn't the end of the conversation. We hope this is sort of just one part of a continuing conversation, and we can certainly hope to improve educational outcomes for all in the Pacific. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tim.